All right, just as I did with war and comparing the medieval and modern circumstances, I want to do this with pestilence. This may be a somewhat easier comparison given everyone's experience in recent years with COVID 19, making this video in 2024. And obviously, everyone who is watching this, at least at this point, has lived through this, has some intimate knowledge of this, has potentially had their lives upended in various ways, or even lost loved ones, and so perhaps can identify with some of the sources that document the Black Death, right? And so this comparison should come readily. And as I've taught this in recent years in the classroom, I have seen students automatically kind of gravitate toward, thoughts about COVID-19 in connection with the Black Death. So let's talk about a few points of comparison. This is, again, not an exhaustive list. This is, just a way to get your mind working on this. But feel free to come up with your own points of comparison. One of these would be the initial reactions. You were assigned to read Gabriele de Musis's account of the arrival of the Black Death in Italy. We could also draw on other sources in the Horrocks book, which were either assigned or not assigned. But there's a good deal of documentation about the initial reactions, right? And the just confusion, the desperation, the fear events there, right? The whole kind of emotional set of circumstances is palpable in all of these documents, pretty much. And we might compare this to the experience with first learning about and perhaps becoming afraid of COVID-19. I recall when I first, got worried about this. I had heard about it a few days prior to this, but I was in a classroom with a colleague and some students, and we were talking about this, and my colleague, who was much more kind of up on this and in the know than I was, said, well, the mortality rate for this disease so far, and this is when it was still pretty much in China, and there were only a few cases in the United States, if any. I can't even. This was very early on, but she said that the mortality rate for this is like 2%. It ended up being not that high, at least by the statistics we have, but that 2% of people who were contracting the disease were dying of it was a serious cause for concern, and I remember realizing at that moment. This is gonna be serious. This is something to be seriously worried about, and this is going to upend our lives. And my mind was actually drawn to the Black Death, which I have studied since I was an undergrad. And so, anyway, that's a personal reaction to this, but I think perhaps you could trace this back into news stories that were emerging early in the modern pandemic and kind of compare that with the Gabriele de Musis and other documents. And just see what people are saying, see how people are responding at that point when we're talking like February, March, April of 2020. Measures taken to mitigate the disease. We talked through a number of these with the Black Death. You've got the religious response. It's like we need more prayers because God's angry with us. There are, of course, measures like quarantines, and given that they believed it was caused by miasma or bad air, they tried to take steps to clean up the air by evicting or sending out people who produced bad smells, like craftsmen who did smelly work. Out of cities, the quarantines and kind of closing of towns was a major element of the measures taken to mitigate the disease. And we might compare this to quarantines and social isolation and those sorts of things in COVID. There's a lot to. Obviously, there's a good deal of difference given the kind of modern circumstances of transportation and technology and all of that. We could still stay connected to people because we have mass communication, but in the Middle Ages, there's a good deal of commonality, right, between these two cases of pestilence when it comes to this issue. Assigning blame and punishing those perceived at fault, right? There was a fair amount of anti-Chinese sentiment that cropped up in COVID-19, at least early on. This went to the kind of highest echelons of power in the government. There were people who were kind of castigating the Chinese, and there were conspiracy theories out there about the Chinese had, manufactured this disease to, send to their rivals or whatever. I mean, this went in crazy directions. Just as there were conspiracy theories in the Middle Ages, in the Black Death, right? The flagellants were often inspirers. That's this image, of course, up here. They were often inspirers of violence, of radical, efforts to get at those perceived at fault. This was especially the case for the Jews. In some communities, those who were already ill, like lepers, there were leper colonies in some parts of Europe, and lepers were often targeted as responsible for this, as poisoning the wells or corrupting the air or something like that, right? And how do these things compare in their sentiment, and how do they compare in their effects? I think that's another interesting way to approach this as a comparative history. The role of and reaction to medical professionals. We read the account of the physicians, the medical faculty at the University of Paris, and their explanations for this, which linked, as was common in medieval thought, linked astrology to the elements of the earth and the corresponding humors in the human body. And this was the state of knowledge at the time, and they were doing their best to explain this and then to suggest remedies for this, right? If the air is corrupt and it's causing disease in the body, then you have to look at the corresponding humor, which would be the blood, and you've got to do something about the blood. You've got to release the bad blood by bleeding or cupping or something like that. Were they taken seriously? Physicians tended to live in rather rarefied, learned circles. They didn't necessarily treat patients on a day-to-day basis, at least not common people, right? The responsibility for that was in the hands of more craftsmen, who had learned through practical experience how to do these things. Actually, the barbers of Europe were often did simple surgery and, prescribed herbal remedies for things. In some cases, like midwives fulfilled a similar sort of function. And given that they were women, they unfortunately were often, held up under suspicion. There wasn't a lot of accusations of witchcraft going on in the 14th century, though this fear surrounding things like the Great Famine and the Black Death, as we've discussed, may have spurred some of that thinking that, these marginalized women in particular were up to no good. Anyway, there are all sorts of connections we could draw there, right? How does this compare then to the role that medical professionals played in the COVID pandemic? The face of the scientific and medical response to COVID in the United States was Anthony Fauci, who was, kind of he was called the COVID czar. He was a physician working in government, kind of setting policy for COVID. He ran afoul at times of politicians like President Trump, in some sectors of the society in the United States thought that Fauci was actually partially to blame for the upending of their lives, right? Fauci was talking about wearing masks and social distancing, and some people were rejecting those as effective remedies and had their own kind of counter evidence for this, right? Some of which was really quite compelling to some people, and so medical professionals were often seen as more harmful than doing more harm than good, or making a bad situation even worse with their recommendations or something like that, right? So I think that there's a good comparison to be made. We might just speak generally about things like political and social effects, and some of what we've already said with these more kind of specific issues really have to do with the politics and the organization of society. Like, how does this upend things? One of the things we discussed in the Black Death section was that because so many people died, right, peasants that were fewer in number, and with basic economics, they could demand higher wages, or better working conditions, better pay, right? The nobility did not want to do this. They saw this as an illegitimate request, and they tried to solidify existing systems and existing arrangements in place through laws and decrees and these sorts of things. And this led, in some cases, to peasant uprisings. Now, this was often exacerbated by war, and the course of the war is going badly for France in the Hundred Years' War in the 1350s, a few years after the Black Death really decimates that kingdom. And you have the uprising of the Jacquerie in 1358. Further outbreaks of plague continued in the 14th century, and in 1381 you have the Wat Tyler Revolt in England, right, which is sort of after the war has gone badly for England, and they're seen as squandering tax money. And so, the plague is bound up with all of this. Peasants come to have greater power just by the basic forces of economics. How might we look at the effects in the Black Death and then compare them and contrast them with modern circumstances? Well, the social effects are obvious, and the economic effects, right? That people had to work remotely. They had to adjust. I'm recording this in my home office, for instance, which I converted from a walk-in closet. I'm in a 5 foot by 7 foot space here. May account for some of the acoustics of this, but I was forced to do that because I was working at home, and I really did not have an effective space in which to work that I could do without being disturbed. And so, this is part of what a lot of us faced. Like, our lives were turned upside down. We had to adjust, and we had to, find different ways of engaging with society and the economy than we had done before. And in some cases, there was a good deal of discontent evinced by people, and even protest. We don't want to do these things. We don't think that we're in as much danger as people have said. And then this certainly was linked to the opinions of politicians, and some became champions of one cause or another, one position or another, right, leading to greater polarization. I think that you see similar kinds of effects, but obviously some pretty serious contrasts too with the Black Death period. And then the cultural effects. How did this impact people? The way that they thought about the world around them, the way that they imagined their own identities and their own existence. I think you could probably do some interesting research into social media as a manifestation of popular culture, though you'd have to go back to like old posts made during the, kind of in the height of the pandemic, perhaps, to really get at this. But, sort of compare that to shifting notions of culture, different manifestations of the imagination. We looked at, in the death chapter, or the death section of this course, we looked a lot at these depictions of deathbed scenes, right? The Ars Moriendi. And a lot of that is inspired by the Black Death. We also looked at the kind of the triumph of death scenes, okay, and the dance of death scenes that are depicted in art. Are there corresponding things, in the culture post-pandemic? Does this come out in television shows, or in movies, or in novels, or in, short stories, or poetry, or whatever it is, right, that we consume? Television, do we see that? I think that we probably do, but I'll leave that to your imagination and your thought process to kind of conceive of. So find something to compare. You have a choice of, comparing wars of the Middle Ages with wars of recent times, or pestilence. You really can't do both in this paper. I will do a very short third video which kind of talks through the paper prompt. So I'll come back to some of this. Thanks.